Well, let's turn to James chapter 1, but we're going to go to verse 13. So, James chapter 1 and verse 13. James 1, verse 13. Let no man say when he is tempted, I am tempted of God. For God cannot be tempted with evil, neither tempteth he any man. But every man is tempted when he is drawn away of his own lust and enticed. Then when lust hath conceived, it bringeth forth sin, and sin, when it is finished, bringeth forth death. Do not err, my beloved brethren. Every good gift and every perfect gift is from above, and coming down from the Father of lights, with whom is no variableness, neither shadow of turning. Of his own will he begat us with the word of truth, that we should be a kind of first fruits of his creatures. And may the Lord bless the reading of his word. Now, as we consider this text, I want to look first at verse 14. It begins with these words, but every man is tempted. And I would say that there is no one among us who doubts the truth of that statement. Everyone is tempted. Temptation is a common experience of every human being, non-Christian or Christian. And Paul goes on to say, Paul, as opposed to James, whose gospel we're reading, whose letter we're reading, Paul goes on and says that there is no temptation that has taken us, but such is common to man. But God is faithful, who will not suffer you to be tempted above that ye are able, but will with every temptation also make a way of escape, that you may be able to bear it. Being tempted is not uncommon. Being tempted or tried is not unique in its basic nature either. We all face the battle of temptation, of trial, and how we deal with it is a mark of the genuineness of our faith, or the lack of true saving faith in our lives. In verses 2 through 12, James gave us the instructions on our attitude as we face temptation or trial, and how it is a test of genuine faith. Count it all joy, he says. And he also says that we need to know there is a purpose in it all. Knowledge. Seek wisdom, he says. Seek wisdom to guide you. And for that, he says, go to God. Because rich or poor, we need the wisdom of God. And part of the wisdom of God about temptation is that we need to know the very nature of temptation itself. How does it begin? How does it work? What's it made of? And whose fault is it? And how can we overcome it? You know, it is normal for the unsaved, the lost, sinful soul to not accept blame for their sinfulness. When they're tempted and fall into sin, when they commit sin, it's normal for them to put the blame somewhere else. Children come into the world with this natural bent to sin, inherited from the sin of Adam. And part of that inherited sinful nature is refusing to take responsibility for their behavior. The first time you reprimand your child for something, their natural reaction is to say, I didn't do it. It wasn't my fault. But you just don't understand. But accepting the full responsibility for weakness is not something that the unsaved man or child does very well. You don't need to teach children to pass the buck. You don't need to teach children to lie or to cheat or to steal. Those things come naturally. If children are not instructed and not corrected, they shirk the guilt for their own wrong, and they grow up to be adults who do the very same thing. And in this passage, James is saying how you respond to trial and temptation and where you put the blame is another indicator of the genuineness of your faith or the lack of it. Now, in a sense, there is this change from verses 12 to 13, and it's a quick change for James. He's been talking about trials. He's been using the same verb, the same pronoun. That means trials or tribulations. He's been using the word to talk about trials that the Lord allows to come into our life to make us strong. And he has said that the person who endures those trials is blessed. Those trials, we learn, are outward circumstances that test our faith and produce spiritual growth. They naturally occur around us, and we all face them. But those trials can become a temptation to sin. Not just a trial, but a real temptation to sin. They can take up residence in our heart and mind and become more than a challenge. They can become a threat to our spiritual life. Trials are like the birds that may fly over our head. They're a nuisance, but they're not a threat. But if they build a nest in your hair, now that's another problem. And likewise, temptations that we let take up residence in our mind and heart will become a source of solicitation to evil instead of the encouragement to our growth that God intends. If we let that trial fester, it becomes a real temptation. Every difficult thing that comes into my life will strengthen me if and when I obey God and stay confident in his care and trust in his power. But if I am tempted to doubt God, to deny his word, to disobey, to do what I selfishly desire, temptation becomes an invitation and an enticement to do evil. The difference is how you respond to trial and temptation. Respond with obedience, you'll find it's a means of spiritual growth. Respond with disobedience, and it turns into a temptation and an invitation to sin that could cost you your salvation. So James makes this shift from trials, which lead to growth and blessing, to temptations, which lead to sin and death. He says that is their end. The end of sin is death. Every circumstance of life that we face then demands a decision. Will I patiently endure temptation? Will I move ahead in faith in God by obedience to his word and grow in my faith? Or will I listen to the voice that suggests the easy way out? And disobedience comes and we fall into sin. Now, if I fall into sin, whose fault is it? If God, is it God's fault who brings the trial or allows it? Is it the fault of my circumstances? Is it the fault of God because he created me just the way I am and I can't help it? Whose fault is it? If God brings the trials, if he allows them, then is he responsible when they become temptations to sin? The issue is, who is to blame in temptation that leads to sin? And that's the heart of this passage. And it's an essential thing because it really is something as old as sin itself. As a matter of fact, back in Genesis chapter 3, Adam and Eve had already fallen into sin and they're confronted by God. God speaks to Adam in verse 9 and says, "Where are you, Adam?" And Adam says, "I'm hiding." I'm surprised God didn't just say, "Adam, you can't hide." But he phrased it in the form of a question. "Where are you?" He said, Adam said, "Well, I heard your voice, but I was afraid because I was naked and I hid myself." Strange thing is that Adam had never hid himself from God before, but he had committed sin, and he was afraid of facing an infinite and holy God, so he was hiding. God said to him in verse 11, "Who told you you were naked?" And all of a sudden, Adam had this self-consciousness that he never had before. And God asked him, says, "Have you eaten of the tree thereof I have commanded you that you should not eat?" Now, what did Adam have to do at that point? All he had to do was to say, "Yes, I did that." But you know what he said? "The woman whom you gave me, she gave me of the tree and I did eat." Whose fault is it? Well, Adam accuses the woman. I mean, after all, he went to sleep one night and he had never seen a woman in his life before, and he woke up the next morning and he was married to one. He didn't even know what a woman was. But the real issue here is not that he is blaming Eve. Whose fault was it ultimately? Oh, it's God's fault, Adam was saying. "You gave her to me. You're the one that made her. Why did you make her a woman who would lead me astray like that? Why did you make a woman who would do that?" But you know, Adam is not the only one who blamed God. Notice in verse 13, "And the Lord said unto the woman, what is it that thou hast done?" And the woman said, "Well, the serpent beguiled me and I did eat." Now, she didn't accuse God directly, but she was implying that really, when you get down to the bottom line, God is at fault. Her subtle argument was this: "I'm the victim. I'm the victim, just like my husband, of something you created. I was in this wonderful garden. Everything was beautiful. And all of a sudden, a snake showed up. I didn't make the snake. I didn't make the snake talk." And so the blame is actually placed on God. And it seems like it's been that way ever since. People say, "Well, God made me. God made me with sinfulness. God made me with circumstances. God put me in the situation I'm in. God gave me my surroundings. It's not my fault." Isaiah 63:17 has this strange statement: "Why, Lord, do you make us wander from your ways and harden our hearts so that we don't revere you?" And that's the Old Testament. What a terrible thing to blame God for your sin. It surprises me, when people who don't even love God, don't even profess to know him, but they'll still blame God. And they'll ask, why is God allowing this? Or why is God doing this? That's common to all men. We'll blame God by blaming circumstances. I couldn't help it. It was an impossible circumstance. Blaming God for our weakness, our propensities, blaming God for our surroundings because of the friends that are around us. Blaming our relatives, blaming our family, blaming our economic conditions, or whatever. And so in verse 13, James says, "Let no man say when he is tempted, I am tempted by God." Matthew 4 says, the Holy Spirit led Jesus in the wilderness to be tested to be tempted, if you will, by the devil. But he led him out to be tested. And since he passed all the tests, none of them became a temptation to sin, because he passed them by obeying and appealing to the Father. And all through those tests, he was proven to be the Son of God. And then the angels came and ministered to him. In Matthew 6:13, it says, lead us not into temptation. And that again has to do with trials. Matter of fact, it's the same word that James uses. God does not send sin to tempt us. We do that on our own. We look for it. Our heart, if we don't have it right, is looking for it. This is, incidentally, from the Lord's Prayer, lead us not into temptation. It is the cry of the heart of a saint who is saying, oh God, as I pray, do not lead me into any trial that is more than I could bear. Lord, lead us not into trials by using sin to entice us that would be more than we can handle. And God doesn't do that. The Lord will answer the prayer of a saint, of a Christian, a sincere Christian who says, lead us not into temptation. 1 Corinthians says, but God is faithful, who will not suffer you to be tempted above that you are able to bear, but will with the temptation also make a way of escape. Lead us not into the power of some trial, Lord, that is beyond us. And God says, I'm not going to do that. The prayer of Matthew 6, the Lord's Prayer, that's what it's saying. God tempts no one. He allows temptation to go on, and men like David can make a choice, but God does not tempt with sin. He allows us to be tempted, even as he allowed Christ to be tempted and tested, but never more than we are able to bear, and always with the necessary resources for victory, if we choose those resources. James says the nature of God and the very nature of evil itself tell us that God is not the source of a temptation to sin, because evil is contrary to his nature in any form. The nature of fallen man is the problem. And James says every man is tempted when he is drawn away of his own lusts and enticed. You see, it is this fallen nature of man that is tempted when he is drawn away. Drawn away and enticed are two very interesting words. The first one comes from hunting. It is a trap that is baited, and an animal is then lured into the trap, and it means to be drawn in by an inward power. There's something in that animal that wants that bait. There's something that desires it. The second then is enticed. And that is a fishing term. That means literally to capture or catch, and is literally used to describe catching fish with a bait. My brother Dale would tell you that different fish like different bait, but there's always something that any particular fish likes as bait. In 2 Peter 2, verse 14 and 18, it is translated to allure or to beguile. It means to entice, to catch a fish with bait. The problem is this: every person is tempted when the hook is baited or the trap is baited by our own lusts. And one being tempted is lured and then hooked and trapped in sin. Oh, the bait looks good. It's attractive. It's always inviting. And you see the bait. And instead of the anticipated pleasure when the hook is grabbed or the trap that's being used is tripped, there comes this pain And James says, and it actually leads to death. And it's that way with temptation to sin. It dangles out there and promises a tasty treat. It promises a satisfying meal. It promises pleasure and fun and reward. And it lures the victim into a trap and a hook. So whose fault is that? What pulls us so strongly to the bait? Is it God? No. Is it Satan? No. Is it Satan that baits the hook? Yes. And the world baits the hook, and the demons bait the hook, and men bait the hook. But what pulls us to the hook? It's the thrill. It's the alcohol. It's the buzz. It's the nicotine. James says lust pulls you in, and that is part of the nature of man. Notice it says he draws away he is drawn away by his own lust. That original language says that lust is his own, a particular bent of lust, which is really the same thing that lures him to the bait. So lust is personal, it's individual. It can be hidden deep within the heart and the soul. And one person's passion may be another's repulsion. Sexual perversion, drugs, tobacco, alcohol, pornography, vulgar language may appear to be abhorred. But the unsaved or the wavering man will pick up one or more of them and make it their personal lust. And that's why James is individualizing this by saying that the man is driven by his own lust. It's a lust in the heart and the soul of the individual. And then he says, when lust has conceived, and incidentally, that is a word that is literally describing when a woman conceives. Is like a mother conceiving, he says. It will bring forth a child, and the child is sin, and that sin then produces death. Now, most people think of sin as a solitary act, or a series of acts or behaviors. But God is saying that sin is the result of a process. It starts with a desire. It begins with the feeling of wanting to be satisfied, wanting something that's been dangled in front of you, and it does something to you. It makes you feel a longing, and that's where it all starts. Sin begins with a desire. And then desire creates a deception in your mind, and you begin to justify and rationalize that you have the right for that which you desire. You have a reason for it. You have an excuse. And that's what verse 14 means when it says, being drawn away and enticed. The hook is baited, the trap is baited, and it deceives the intellect. And then lust conceives, he says. Now the plan to pull sin off begins to form. And this occurs with the will. You've gone from the emotion to the mind, and now your will is engaged. The design is conceived in the person's soul, and he figures out how it can be justified. And then we have disobedience. The act occurs, and it brings forth sin. And when sin is born, sin is a murderer. It brings death. And what a picture that is. The imagery of burying a child is so beautiful until the child is born and the child turns out to be a killer. Sin is a killer. The wages of sin is death, spiritual death, separating the soul from God. Physical death separates the soul from the body, but eternal death separates the soul and the body from God. Do not err, my beloved brethren. Every good gift, every perfect gift is from above and cometh down from the Father of lights, with whom is no variableness, neither shadow of turning. Of his own will he begat he us with the word of truth, that we should be a kind of first fruit of his creatures. Every good gift, every perfect gift is from God, from above, he says. The only things that come down from him are good. They're perfect. He possesses a nature that gives rise to good things. God does not send sinful things. The nature of God only produces good. And notice that God is called the Father of lights. That was an ancient Jewish way of referring to God as the Creator. The Creator of all the universe, the lights and the stars. The lights they have in mind are the sun, the moon, and the stars. He is the Father of lights. He is the one who created all of the universe, all of its stars. He created everything, but he's not like them. They vary. They change. They dim. They brighten. They cast shadows. We have the night, for instance. First it's here, and then it's gone in the daytime. And then we have the daytime, which goes away, and night comes, and then the cycle continues to repeat. Their benefit to us comes and goes. But God isn't like that. God's brilliant light of glory, God's light of goodness and grace doesn't vary. In 1 John 1:5, in him is no shadow of turning, it says. Malachi 3:6, I am the Lord, he says, and I change not. There are no days when God stops giving spiritual light. The flow of good things from God never varies. It never stops. So fill up on divine gifts, on divine good things. As the congregational song that we sang this morning, come thou fount of every blessing. Tune my heart to sing thy grace. Streams of mercy, never ceasing, call for songs of loudest praise. And finally, in verse 18, of his own will he begot us with the word of truth, that we should be a kind of first fruits of his creation. He begot us. He has made us born again through his word and his great grace. He has given us new life. Augustine became a great saint of God. But before that, he had lived with a prostitute before his conversion. And after he was wondrously saved, he was walking down the street, and that same prostitute saw him. She shouted his name and kept walking toward him. He saw her, but he kept his eyes straight forward, and he walked on. She continued after him, crying after him, and ran after him. And finally, she said, Augustine, it is I. To which he replied, I know, but it is no longer I. Oh, the change that comes when we are reborn. We are reborn when God saves us. We become a new creation. We become sensitive to his will. We understand what it is to be heartbroken when we disappoint him. And thank God for that. Don't be discouraged by the fact that when you disappoint God, it breaks your heart and it discourages you. Wipe that discouragement away, because God hasn't changed. He'll forgive you if you confess your sin, and he'll give you the strength then to obey. We become a new creation. We become his own possession that allows us to overcome evil if we use the means of grace, the weapons of our warfare. And that's prayer, and the Word of God and the disciplined mind that seeks God's will. Ask for the wisdom of God that brings strength and spiritual accountability to stop sin before the point where it even starts. A trial is one thing. Don't let it become a temptation to sin.